Greetings, people who are obviously gluttons for theoretical punishment. In my previous videos, I talked about all the systems I developed, all the ones I invented, except for one, the scale phrase system. Now, ironically enough, the scale phrase system was the system that I completed first. I completed it first, but since it's kind of complicated and a little strange, I held off on this one for last to talk about this one at the very end. So if you can bear with me, I'd like to show you the system I invented to possibly better understand scales, musical scales. Now, if you watched any of my previous videos, you will remember that in 1972 I had this tremendous urge to research music and to dig in and discover something, but I didn't know what. Then I met my first wife and I started building a family. I sold my fancy accordion and I got off the path of music theory. Then in 1984, as mentioned in my previous videos, I got a renewed interest in theory and I worked on it a little bit. But then I met my second wife and I started building a family. I had a wonderful wife, I still do, and 3 wonderful children, blah, blah, blah. So I got away from music a little bit. Then finally in 1996, we moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and as I mentioned in previous videos, I bought a book by John Mahegan. It was called Improvising Jazz Piano. And I bought it because I wanted to try to learn how to play piano correctly, which I never did. I never learned to play anything correctly, but while I was reading the book, I got to page 62. This is the actual page from the book, 62. I have a few pages of the book left. And on that page, there was hardly any type. You can see my scribble here, but basically, there was hardly any original text on that page. There was just a very little bit of text. And I couldn't stop looking at this page. And what the page shows is the modes that we're familiar with, the Greek modes that most people are familiar with, and that's all it shows. It didn't have any of this scribble on here, didn't have any of this scribble down here. This is all my scribble. All right? So when I got to this page, I realized all of a sudden that what I was unconsciously seeking in 1972 through 1996 was this. And it showed me, this page showed me, and it made clear to me that even though everybody in the Western world uses, let's say, 20 to 40 scales, those scales were hodgepodge. They were very disorganized in classification, and it was just a mess. I called them a mixed bag of methods. I called the contemporary scale system a mixed bag of methods, and also I referred to it as a coalescence of 2 schools of thought. And one of those schools was traditional and one contemporary. It was just a mixed up, jumbled up mess. That's what I thought. And I thought, well, I'll research, and back then there was internet, but it wasn't so good. And I looked all around and I couldn't find anybody in the world trying to clean up scales and create an actual system. I couldn't find anybody. In fact, I still can't to this day, and this is 2019. So I thought, well, I'll go back in time as far as I have to see when somebody got the idea of trying to use or classify successive tones. In other words, a group of successive tones. And I ended up back in Greece. All right, I got back to Greece to 330 BCE. All right, that's how far back I got. And I found a thing called a tetrachord. And that's a group of 4 tones. In other words, tetra means 4. Chord means a group of 2 or more tones, ordinarily. So you have tetrachord, a group of 4 tones. And one of the examples would be this. it's tones in descending order, because that's how they classify. That's how they listed them, in descending order. So at least they had a start. They had a start of some sort of system. Now, I'm not talking about the Chinese, because the Chinese had all kinds of good stuff, but I won't get into that. That's for the experts. I'm not qualified to talk about that. So I went back to Greece to get my starting point, all right? Now, you say, well, what was the criterion? You can't just pick 4 tones out of thin air. So they had a criterion. They said the criterion will be such that from the first to the 4th tone, the interval musically will be a perfect 4th. All right? Now, way back in the day, back in Greece, many, many years ago, we don't know where they got this. They might have got it from Pythagoras, the great thinker, or they might have got it from somebody else, but they determined that from this note, this tone to this tone, all right, it's going to be an interval of a perfect 4th. And back then it was probably pretty rough. And we have here in this example an interval of a whole step. And here we have a whole step and a half step. And so what you have here is, as part of the criterion, you have 4 tones with an interval between the first and the last tone of 5 half steps. 5 half steps. So that's your tetrachord. Then somebody thought, you know what, we're going to have more than one type. We're going to have 3 types, and there might have been more, but all I know is what the history books and the internet tells me, so I'm just repeating what I learned. So 3 types. One called the diatonic, which I just showed. Then there was the chromatic. Now in the chromatic, you see we have between the E and the C sharp, we have 3 half steps. And between the C sharp and C, you have a half step. And between the C and the B, a half step. And then with the enharmonic tetrachord, you have here between the E and the C 4 half steps. And between the C and the B, a quarter step. Okay, that's half of a half step. And between this B and B prime, the actual B that we're familiar with, you have another quarter step. So you see you had basically 3 main types that they focused on. And so they played around with them for a while. Then at some point, somebody said, well, that's only 4 tones. We want to build a longer succession of tones, and it'll possibly be more useful. So the Greek theorists, long time ago, all right, they created basically what we might call the first modes. They took a tetrachord, a group of 4 tones, and another tetrachord, and they put them side by side. They put them in succession. And here you see in this example, you have a tetrachord with the last note of this tetrachord is actually the first note or first tone of this tetrachord. So they called that mode conjunct. They called this system conjunct because you see the last tone of this tetrachord is the same as the first tone of that one. Then you had your half steps, all right? Now in these examples, I'm using the diatonic version of the tetrachord, all right? Diatonic. So what they did was, to make a mode, all right, they put the first tetrachord this way, all right? Instead of duplicating the E, they just used a single E. Then they finished that tetrachord, and they added on an A on the end. And then between that B and that A, there's a whole step, all right? So that was your conjunct form or system of combining 2 tetrachords. And you see here, essentially, you have what might be today called a modern day scale, right? So you had your whole step, half step, then your whole step, half step, and the extra whole step at the end. So somebody else said, well, you know what I like? I like 2 tetrachords, all right, joined, but I don't want that same tone here in the middle. So they took a tetrachord here and a tetrachord here, and here they have that extra whole step between the B and the A. Now they have what you call a disjunct pair of tetrachords, or a disjunct mode, right? I don't know if you can see that. And those were the 2 different early modes. Now you see here in both examples that descending order is the rule of the day. Descending order was the way they did it. All right, so many, many years passed. Basically, from 330 BCE to about 400 CE, you have almost 700 years or so. So modes developed, but they kind of didn't develop until Middle Age theorists, in other words, people from the Middle Ages, all right, theorists decided, well, we want to do better. We want to elaborate. We want this to evolve. So I chose these numbers, 400 to 1550, roughly, very roughly, as my Middle Age period. That's for my mind, you know, to understand this time-wise. So now they have tetrachords, but they like them in ascending order. They say, you know what, ascending order makes a little more sense, a little bit more clear. All right, so they change the order from descending to ascending. All right, then also they introduced more combinations of whole and half steps. In other words, they have tetrachords with different combinations of whole and half steps, and they created quite a few. All right, and another noteworthy feature of this period was the fact that they preferred the diatonic form of the tetrachord. That's what they preferred. They said, we like this the best. We're kind of going to shy away from the chromatic and the enharmonic version. We're kind of get away from that, which they ultimately did. All right, so they preferred the diatonic form, and you can see from this little chart here, this little rough chart, that basically your modes came first. And you can also see, you say, well, look, that looks like a scale to me. Well, eventually the modes were theoretically and psychologically transformed into the idea of a scale. In other words, the terminology changed and the perspective changed. But you see here the very beginnings of the scale system that we use today. Now, I looked at this, I studied this at length. I got all the books I could find. A lot of them I actually purchased, and I thought, well, let's not throw away everything. Let's keep some of the old ideas, but let's change them a little bit to try to make them work. What can we do to change the basics, the fundamentals, and what can we do to reconstruct it, put it back together, and make it much more clear? Well, that's what I want to do, and that's what I'm going to try to explain in my next few videos. So thanks for being incredibly patient, and we'll take it from there. Good night.